When your own child tells you that you don't need sunlight anymore, that you belong in the basement, something inside of you breaks, and something else inside of you wakes up. That was my turning point. But before I get there, hello, my name is Dorothy Hale. I'm 74 years old, and I've lived long enough to see the best and the worst of people. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Go ahead and write it in the comments. It warms me to think of this story reaching so many corners of the world. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, for most of my life. My home was my sanctuary. My late husband, Harold, and I bought it more than 40 years ago. A modest but warm 2-story house with wide windows, a creaky wooden porch, and a small garden where I grew roses and tomatoes. Harold used to joke that sunlight was my fuel. Every morning I'd open every curtain just to let the day pour in. After he passed, those little beams of light were what kept me steady. When my son, Mark, and his wife, Sandra, moved in with me, I thought it would be a blessing. They told me they wanted to help after Harold's passing. They said it would be good for everyone, me not being alone, and them saving money while they got on their feet. I believed them. At first, it even felt nice having the company. The house echoed less. The early days weren't bad. Sandra cooked dinners, Mark helped mow the lawn, and their children, 2 young teenagers, breathed a little life into the quiet rooms. I found joy in making them pancakes on Saturday mornings, the way I had when Mark was a boy. I thought, maybe this is what family is meant to look like after loss. Together. Strong. But slowly, the tone shifted. Sandra had a way of speaking that cut deeper than she realized, or perhaps she knew exactly what she was doing. She'd sigh whenever I insisted on keeping my old curtains, muttering things like, "This place is so dated. One day it'll actually look nice." She rearranged my kitchen without asking, moved my teacups into the back cupboard, and said, "You won't need those much anymore. You don't host anyone." Mark brushed it off when I mentioned it. "She just likes things neat, Mom. Don't take it personally." So I tried not to. I told myself it was just adjustment, but I began to notice whispers between them. Late at night, when they thought I was asleep, their voices would carry down the hall. Words like her space and money and once it's ours. I pretended I didn't hear. I wanted to trust my son. I wanted to believe family couldn't betray family. Still, there were moments that gave me pause. Sandra once made a joke to her friend while I was watering my plants on the porch. She laughed and said she clings to those flowers like they're her purpose. "I guess when you're old, the little things are all you've got." Her friend chuckled. I pretended not to notice, but my hands shook as I trimmed a rose stem. It was as though, little by little, they were shifting the ground beneath me. I went from being the homeowner, the matriarch of my small world, to feeling like a guest, an inconvenient one, in my own house. Yet I kept my head high. I told myself that Harold built this home for us, and as long as my name was on the deed, this was still my place of safety. That belief kept me steady, even as I began to feel the walls closing in. But I didn't realize how quickly the warmth of family could turn into coldness, or how fast a house could stop feeling like a home. Because soon they would come to me with a suggestion so cruelly wrapped in false kindness that it would change everything. They would tell me it was for my comfort. They would tell me I didn't need sunlight anymore. And that was the day they moved me into the basement. It started on an ordinary afternoon, though I remember every detail like it's etched into my skin. I was sitting in my favorite chair by the upstairs window, a quilt wrapped over my knees, sunlight warming my face. That small ritual was my comfort. Tea in hand, light pouring through the curtains, the garden below alive with roses. Mark and Sandra came in together, their voices low but steady, like they'd rehearsed. Sandra perched on the arm of the sofa, her smile far too sweet, while Mark stood with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Mom," Mark began, his tone careful, We've been thinking about your comfort. My stomach dropped before he finished the sentence. Nothing good ever comes after those words. Sandra leaned forward, clasping her hands as though she were a nurse about to deliver bad news. The stairs are getting harder for you, aren't they? We thought maybe it's time you move somewhere. Easier. I blinked. Easier? The basement, Mark said quickly. It's safer, Mom. No stairs to worry about. Everything you need in one place. It just makes sense. The basement. My basement. A place I used for storing Christmas. Boxes and Harold's old tools. A place that smelled of dust and damp cement, with one tiny half window that barely let in a sliver of morning light. That's where they thought I belonged. I stared at them. Sandra filled the silence with her syrupy voice. You don't really need sunlight, do you? You barely go outside anymore. We'll fix it up nice for you. Your own little space. My breath caught in my throat. You don't need sunlight. As though I were a plant they had decided didn't deserve to grow anymore. I'm fine where I am, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Sandra's smile thinned. It'll just be temporary, Dorothy. The kids need more space upstairs. They're growing. And Mark, my own son, nodded along. It'll help us all, Mom. Please don't make this difficult. There it was. The final push. Not a suggestion, but a decision already made. My comfort wasn't the reason. They wanted my space. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the sunlight fading from the window. I thought of Harold, how he'd promised this home would always be mine, a place of warmth and love. Now I was being lowered into the shadows. The move happened quickly. They brought down a cot, an old dresser, and a single lamp. I carried my own quilt downstairs, my hands trembling, my heart heavier than it had been in years. The basement greeted me with its cold silence. The concrete floor sent a chill through my slippers, and the ceiling felt lower than I remembered. They tried to paint it as kindness, but every detail screamed exile. Sandra patted the bed, satisfied. See? Cozy. Mark kissed my forehead. You'll get used to it. And then they left, closing the door behind them. Their footsteps grew faint as they returned upstairs, up to the sunlight, up to the laughter, up to the life I was now barred. I sat there, staring at the single bulb swinging faintly above me. For the first time, my house no longer felt like mine. I was a guest in the place I had built, a prisoner in the space I'd once used for storage. The days blended after that. Meals left on a tray by the basement door, voices muffled above me, like the world was carrying on without me. When I climbed upstairs for air, Sandra would remind me, "It's better for you downstairs. Less risk, less risk." As if sunlight itself were dangerous to me. At night, I'd hear them laughing with friends, the thump of music, the smell of cooked meals drifting down through the vents. I lay on the cot, quilt tucked under my chin, and realized I had been quietly erased. But I wasn't done yet. They thought they'd buried me in the dark. What they didn't know was that shadows can sharpen a person's vision, and mine was getting clearer by the day. The first week in the basement was the hardest, not because of the cold or the damp. It was the silence. Silence where my husband's laughter used to echo. Silence where I used to hum along with the radio as I cooked dinner. Silence where my own footsteps no longer carried up the stairs. They fed me like a tenant, not a mother. A tray would appear at the top of the basement steps, sometimes with leftovers, sometimes with just a sandwich and a glass of water. Sandra would call down, "Dinner's ready, Dorothy," but she never waited for a reply. She didn't want me at their table. I'd sit with that plate balanced on my lap, staring at the small rectangle of glass high on the wall. The half window let in a streak of daylight in the mornings, and I found myself chasing it like a cat, moving my chair just to feel it against my skin for a few minutes. By afternoon, the light was gone, and so was my sense of time. The house above me was alive, though. The sounds of Mark and Sandra's world filtered down through the vents. Laughter, clinking dishes. Television shows played loud enough for the whole block to hear. And always, always, the sound of chairs being pulled back at their dinner table. My chair, the one Harold built with his own hands, sat empty upstairs. I tried not to think of it as punishment, but how else could it feel? One night, I heard Sandra on the phone, her voice clear through the thin ceiling. She was speaking to a neighbor, laughing as she said, "Oh, she doesn't need much. She's old. We give her a place. That's enough. She should be grateful." I froze. The words cut sharper than anything she'd said to my face. Grateful? For a cot in a basement that smelled of mildew? For being hidden away like a burden too heavy to be seen? I pressed my fist against my mouth to stop myself from crying out. I would not give them the satisfaction of my voice breaking. Instead, I began to remember. I remembered Harold, sitting beside me in this very house, telling me, "Dorothy, this will always be your safe place. As long as you're here, you're never alone." His promise echoed in my chest, fighting against the loneliness that tried to swallow me whole. I remembered the day we signed the deed, how Harold grinned like a boy, declaring, "No matter what happens, this house is ours, Dorothy, forever." And I realized then, Sandra's laugh, Mark's silence, their whispered plans. It wasn't just about space. It was about ownership, about erasing me from the very foundation of what Harold and I had built. But what they didn't know was that the deed had never left my hands. The house wasn't Mark's. It wasn't Sandra's. It was mine. Each day in the basement, I thought less about their cruelty and more about my power. Quiet power, the kind they underestimated. They believed I was defeated. They believed the silence was my surrender, but it was the opposite. The silence gave me time to think. Time to plan. I stopped crying myself to sleep and started writing lists. What documents I had, what boxes I'd need to move, which memories I'd take with me when the time came. I even kept a small notebook tucked under my quilt, sketching. Ideas like a woman preparing for a journey, because I knew now I wouldn't let them bury me alive. They said I didn't need sunlight, but they were wrong. I didn't just need sunlight. I needed freedom. And if they thought the basement was the end of my story, they had no idea what kind of beginning it had just written for me. The night I heard Sandra call me old and lucky just to have a place, I stopped being afraid of the basement. Something hardened inside me. The same steel Harold always said was hidden beneath my gentle nature. "Dorothy," he used to say, "you look like rose petals, but you've got thorns when you need them." And now, I needed them. I began quietly, carefully. In the mornings, when Mark and Sandra took the kids to school or ran errands, I climbed upstairs. My footsteps were slow and steady, habitual enough that if anyone came home early, I could claim I was just stretching my legs, but I wasn't stretching. I was searching. The first place I went was my bedroom closet, the one Sandra rarely touched. Behind an old shoebox sat a fireproof metal box, one Harold had insisted we keep for just in case. The key had never left my jewelry box, and when I turned it, the soft click made me feel more alive than I had in weeks. Inside, the deed to the house, the mortgage discharge papers, Harold's will, and a folder of bank records. My name, clear as day, on every page. Not Mark's, not Sandra's. Mine. I clutched those documents to my chest like a lifeline, then tucked them carefully into a canvas tote I hid behind my quilt in the basement. Every time I looked at that bag, I felt Harold's presence beside me, reminding me that I wasn't helpless. The next step was harder, reaching out. I had no cell phone. Sandra had once said, "You don't need one. It's too confusing for you," and Mark agreed. But they'd forgotten I still had my old landline phone tucked into a box of Harold's things. I plugged it into the basement outlet one afternoon, And when I heard the dial tone hum, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. There was only one number I knew by heart: Mr. Lawson. He was Harold's oldest friend, a retired lawyer who had helped us draft our will years ago. When he answered, his voice cracked with age, but carried the same steady kindness I remembered. "Dorothy? My goodness, it's been too long. How are you holding up?" I swallowed hard. "Not well, Lawson. They've put me in the basement. They treat me like I don't belong here anymore. But the house, it's still mine, isn't it?" There was a long silence, then a firm reply. "Dorothy, if the deed is in your name, then yes, you are the sole owner. They have no claim unless you give it." My hands trembled as relief washed over me. "Mine, still mine. I think," I whispered, more to myself than to him, "I think I want to sell it." Lawson didn't gasp or scold me. Instead, he spoke softly. "Then let's make sure you do it right, Dorothy. On your terms, quietly." From that moment, the plan took root. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with a real estate agent Lawson recommended. Her name was Mara, a woman in her 30s with a sharp mind, and to my surprise, a gentle respect for me. She didn't look at me as a burden. She looked at me as a client, a homeowner. When I told her my situation, she didn't laugh or brush me off. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing with indignation. "They moved you to the basement? Ma'am, you deserve better than that. Don't worry. We'll keep this quiet." She arranged private showings while Mark and Sandra were away at work. I'd sit at the kitchen table, papers spread before me, while Mara whispered details about offers and buyers. I felt like a secret queen plotting a quiet escape. But even with all this careful planning, doubt lingered. One night, as I folded my husband's old shirts into a box, I broke down. "Harold," I whispered into the still air, "am I doing the right thing? Selling the house you built for us?" For a moment, the basement seemed to hold its breath. Then I remembered his words from so long ago. "This house is for you, Dorothy. For you to be safe, no matter what." Safe. It wasn't safe anymore. Not with Mark and Sandra upstairs, turning my sanctuary into my prison. That night, I dried my tears and made a promise to myself. They would never again have the power to tell me where I belonged. And so the pieces came together. The documents were in order. The buyer had been found. The sale was moving forward faster than I dared hope. Mark and Sandra still laughed above me, still spoke to their friends about how they took care of me. But while they were busy enjoying the sunlight, I was preparing to take away the very roof over their heads, the same roof they thought they had stolen from me. The day that sealed my decision came on a Saturday evening. I could hear the sounds long before I knew what was happening. Laughter, clinking glasses, music loud enough to rattle the basement ceiling. At first I thought maybe they'd gone out, that the sound was drifting from a neighbor's yard. But when I crept up the basement steps and cracked the door open, I realized the noise was coming from my own living room. They were throwing a party. Dozens of people I didn't know filled the rooms Harold and I had once kept so carefully. My table was pushed against the wall, covered in trays of food. My curtains had been taken down completely, leaving the windows bare. Sandra stood in the middle of it all, wine glass in hand, looking like she owned the place. When she saw me, her smile froze. She walked quickly across the room, blocking me before I could step inside. "Oh, Dorothy," she said with mock sweetness, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "This really isn't your kind of crowd. Why don't you stay downstairs where it's quiet? I'll send a plate down for you later." I stared at her. For a moment, I thought about pushing past her, about planting myself right in the center of that room and demanding to be acknowledged. But then Mark appeared behind her, shaking his head slightly. "Mom," he muttered, "don't make a scene. Please. It's just easier this way. Easier this way." The words hit me like a slap. I turned and walked back down the steps, without another word. I heard Sandra's laugh pick back up behind me, heard the clink of glasses, heard my house, the house Harold and I built, roaring with a life I was not allowed to be part of. Back in the basement, I sat on the edge of the cot, my hands shaking. Anger burned hot in my chest, but beneath it was something deeper, something cold and steady. I reached under my quilt and pulled out the canvas tote with my documents. I laid them out across the cot like cards in a game. The deed, the will, the bank records. Proof, clear as day, that I was the only rightful owner of this house. Above me, music thundered. Below, in my hands, was the silence of power. I picked up Harold's photograph from the nightstand, a picture of him in his work overalls, grinning with a hammer in hand the day he built the porch steps. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "I won't let them bury me alive in the house you built for us. I won't let them take everything you left me." That night, long after the party ended, I called Mr. Lawson again. My voice didn't tremble this time. "Lawson," I said, "let's finalize it. Sell the house." He didn't hesitate. "I'll draw up the paperwork first thing Monday." The next few days passed in a blur. Mara, the real estate agent, worked with quiet efficiency. Papers were signed in hushed meetings while Mark and Sandra were at work. I carried boxes to a friend's garage in the mornings, one small load at a time, never enough for them to notice. Each trip, each hidden signature, felt like a step out of the shadows, and still, Mark and Sandra lived above me in blissful ignorance. They argued about bills, joked with their friends about how generous they were to give me space, and talked about future renovations, plans for my kitchen, my living room, my garden. I smiled quietly to myself. Let them dream. Let them think the house was theirs to command, because soon their dreams would collapse. And they would learn that the woman they thought they had buried in the basement still had thorns, and she knew exactly how to use them. The morning I signed the final papers, the world outside felt brighter than it had in months. The autumn sun spilled through the lawyer's office windows, golden and warm, almost mocking the darkness I had been forced into. I held the pen steady, my hand trembling only slightly as I signed my name across the last page. Dorothy Hale. Clear, sharp letters. With each stroke of ink, I felt the weight of the basement, of Sandra's smirks, of Mark's silence lift from my shoulders. When I set the pen down, Lawson looked at me with a small, proud smile. "It's done, Dorothy. The house is sold. The proceeds will be transferred into your account within the week." I exhaled slowly, my chest loosening for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," I whispered. "No, thank you," Mara, the real estate agent, said as she gathered the papers. "You reminded me why I do this. People like you deserve freedom, not cages." Leaving the office, I felt lighter, but there was still work to be done. Quiet work. I returned home that afternoon before Mark and Sandra arrived. With Mara's help, I had arranged movers, professional, discreet. They didn't ask questions, just followed my directions. Box by box, they carried out the life I had chosen to take with me: Harold's photograph albums, my quilt, my teacups, my books, and the small things that mattered. I didn't take everything. I didn't need to. What I wanted most was not furniture or dishes, it was dignity, and that was already packed neatly in my heart. By the time the sun dipped low, the basement was nearly bare. The cot remained, the old dresser stood empty, and the air was heavier than ever. But the canvas tote with my papers was with me. My new beginning was tucked safely in the crook of my arm. The buyers, a young couple with kind smiles, met me the next day to walk through the house. They greeted me with respect, not pity, and promised they'd take care of the garden, the porch, the little things Harold and I had cherished. One of them said softly, "We'll fill this house with light again." I smiled, holding back tears. That was all I needed to hear. The final night I spent in the basement, I didn't cry. I sat with Harold's photo in my hands and whispered, "It's done, love. I've set us free." Above me, I heard Sandra fussing about bills, heard Mark pacing the floor, and I almost laughed. They had no idea their kingdom of entitlement was already gone. In the morning, I'd be gone too. When the transfer cleared, I used part of the money to secure a small apartment in a quiet building across town. Nothing grand, but perfect for me. Sunlit windows, a balcony for plants, and neighbors who smiled kindly in the hall. The rest of the money I placed carefully into a trust, set aside to ensure I would never again rely on anyone's scraps or false kindness. The last time I walked out of that basement, I didn't look back. I stepped into the sunlight, carrying only what mattered, and left the door unlocked for the new owners. For Mark and Sandra, the reckoning was only hours away. When they came home, expecting dinner on the table and their mother in the shadows, they would instead find emptiness. Bare rooms, silent walls, and strangers waiting to tell them the truth. The house no longer belonged to them. It had never belonged to them. And by the time they realized it, I would be miles away, sipping tea in a place where no one could ever again tell me I didn't need sunlight. I wasn't there when they came home. I didn't need to be. But Mara called me later, her voice carrying a mixture of professionalism and poorly hidden amusement. "Dorothy," she said, "you should have seen their faces." It happened on a Tuesday evening. Mark pulled into the driveway after work, Sandra trailing behind him with bags of groceries. From the outside, the house looked the same. The porch steps Harold had built, the garden I had loved. But when they opened the front door, the silence inside wasn't what they expected. The furniture was gone. The curtains Sandra had stripped away were not replaced. Closets stood empty, the kitchen shelves bare. Even the basement door, once my prison, creaked open to reveal only a cot and a hollow dresser. They called my name at first. "Mom, Mom, where are you?" Mark's voice carried down into the basement, but no reply came. Sandra's footsteps echoed sharply as she stormed from room to room, her panic turning to fury. "Dorothy," she snapped, as though scolding a child. But there was nothing left to scold. When the realization began to sink in, that was when the knock came. The young couple, the buyers, stood at the door with Mara beside them, holding a folder of signed documents. Sandra opened the door, her face flushed. "Can I help you?" she demanded. "Yes," Mara said smoothly. "We're the new owners. This property belongs to us now." She handed over the papers, every signature crisp, every page stamped and legal. Mark blinked, the color draining from his face. "That's impossible. This is my mother's house. She wouldn't—" "She did," Mara cut in gently but firmly. "It was her sole right. The deed was in her name. Everything was handled properly." Sandra's voice pitched higher. "No, she wouldn't sell it without telling us. She couldn't." Mara raised an eyebrow. "She didn't need your permission." I could almost hear it in my mind. Sandra's shrill outrage, Mark's stunned silence. The image of them standing in that empty house, realizing they had no control, no claim, no power. It filled me with a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Mark tried calling me, of course, dozens of times, but the number they had was already disconnected. Later that night, Mara told me how Sandra had exploded, her fury filling the air like wildfire. She ranted about betrayal, about how ungrateful I was, about how I had taken everything. Mark didn't shout. He just sat down heavily on the bare couch frame, staring at the papers in his hands, his lips moving but no words coming out. For once, Sandra's voice didn't seem to reach him. He had finally understood. The house had never been his. It was mine. And now, it was gone. As for me, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment that same evening, a cup of tea steaming in my hands. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and lavender. For the first time in weeks, the light poured over me without interruption. I thought of their faces when they opened that door. Shock, anger, the collapse of entitlement. And I smiled. But the story didn't end there. Because freedom wasn't just about leaving the basement. It was about beginning again. About proving, to myself and to them, that I was not someone to be hidden away. And in my new home, with sunlight on my face, I was finally ready to start over. I woke up in my new apartment with sunlight spilling through wide windows, the kind I hadn't felt on my face in months. The warmth hit me like an embrace, wrapping me in a comfort no quilt could ever give. For the first time since Harold passed, I didn't wake to the sound of footsteps above me, or the sting of being told where I belonged. I woke to peace. The apartment wasn't grand, but it was mine. A tidy 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a quiet building. The balcony overlooked a row of maple trees, their leaves already turning golden with autumn. I brought my plants, setting them carefully in the sunlight. My teacups had their own shelf again. Harold's photo sat on the nightstand, looking almost proud. I brewed a pot of tea and sat outside, feeling the air move across my skin. Freedom doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It comes in small moments like that. The steam rising from your cup, the sun warming your shoulders, the knowledge that nobody can tell you to move. I didn't hear from Mark or Sandra again directly. Not a knock on my door, not a letter. But Mara told me they'd tried everything, yelling at her, threatening to call lawyers, demanding to know where I'd gone. None of it mattered. The papers were signed, the money was transferred, and the house was no longer theirs to dream about. Part of me wanted them to come find me, to look me in the eye and try to explain themselves. But another part of me knew they wouldn't. Shame is a heavy cloak, and they weren't strong enough to wear it. My days grew full in a way I hadn't expected. I joined a small gardening group in the community, other women my age who loved their plants as much as I did. We'd sit on folding chairs in the sun, talking about soil and seasons, but also about life, about children who forgot to call, about husbands gone too soon, about the small joys that still carried us. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Sometimes at night, I'd sit with Harold's photograph and tell him everything. How Sandra said I didn't need sunlight. How Mark stood by and let it happen. How I'd taken the house and turned their cruelty into my liberation. "Can you believe it, Harold?" I'd whisper, a smile tugging at my lips. They thought they buried me in the basement. Instead, I walked out into the light. I didn't sell the house out of spite alone. I sold it because no home, no matter how many years it holds, is worth keeping if it becomes your prison. I realized something sitting in that basement. Walls are only safe if they protect you, not if they hide you away. And for those watching this, let me tell you, never let anyone push you into the shadows. Not your children, not your spouse, not anyone who claims to know what's best for you. You are not a burden. You are not invisible. You have more power than they want you to believe. When I take my tea to the balcony now, the sun washes over me, and I close my eyes. I hear laughter from neighbors, the bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves. Life continues, but I am part of it again, not hidden beneath it. Sandra was wrong. I do need sunlight, but what I needed more was freedom, and freedom, at 74 years old, tastes sweeter than anything I've ever known.